Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Mariki Olofsson. I'm the project manager of the Ubuntu Dialogues project at the Stellenbosch University Museum here in Stellenbosch, South Africa. And joining me on the screen today is Dr. Nadia Sanger, one of 9 Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows for 2021, and Professor Amy Yeboah, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I want to welcome you to this event today, also on behalf of my counterpart at Michigan State University, Dr. Upenyu Maji, and the principal investigators on the project, Professor Jamie Monson at Michigan State and Mr. Bongani Mgijima at Stellenbosch University. This webinar is the 6th in this year's exchanges, featuring Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. For those of you who are not familiar with the project, a brief description. The Ubuntu Dialogues project is an international exchange program between Michigan State University in the United States and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The lead department at Michigan State is the African Studies Center, and at Stellenbosch University, the project is hosted by the Stellenbosch University Museum. The seminar exchange program is one of 3 components of the project. Apart from the seminar exchanges, the Ubuntu Dialogue project also involves a student graduate fellowship and a series of conversations between students from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. Our hope is that in opening up these spaces for talking, listening, and indeed for reflecting, as today's topic suggests, will help us all to do the work of revisiting, rethinking, and indeed reimagining the meaning of Ubuntu and what it implies for how we work and live in relation to others. As a white South African, I am implicated in Dr. Sanger's presentation today. I hope that rather than leaning into that space of white fragility that Robin DiAngelo describes, giving into that instinct of defense, I will go to a space that Lisbeth Lipari describes as listening being. Listening as an ethics of attunement, her description. Listening that creates awareness of and pays attention to what binds us, rather than hearing for what confines us to, in Lipari's words, misconceptions of our own making about who we are, what we do, and how we might live peacefully together on this planet. I'm striving for that space today. It is now my pleasure to introduce first today respondent, Professor Amy Yeboah, and then our Ubuntu Dialogues Seminar Exchange Fellow, Dr. Nadia Sanger. Dr. Amy Yeboah, affectionately known as Dr. A, is a daughter of Africa, scholar, data scientist, filmmaker, and Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Howard University. As a Mellon New Direction Fellow, her publications and research employ an Africana Studies framework to examine the intersections of race, gender, and technology. Let me just say, this is what Professor Yeboah sent to me when I asked her how I should introduce her. This biography does not include her work as what I would call a cultural commentator on television and radio, where she has appeared to talk about issues ranging from the legacy of Malcolm X, the history and challenges of Black colleges, the death of George Floyd, and what we can learn about the African diaspora from Beyonce's 2016 album, Lemonade. Professor Yeboah is also a research partner in the Just Futures Initiative at Howard University. Dr. Nadia Sanger is a senior lecturer in the Department of English Studies at Stellenbosch University. Her research interests and writing straddle the humanities and social sciences. and broadly include feminist studies and critical race studies. She worked as a researcher at the Human Sciences Research Council for many years before joining Stellenbosch University. She holds a PhD in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa and a Fulbright postdoc in Women's Studies from the University of Maryland in the United States. Like Professor Yeboah, Nadia is a regular contributor to the media and as one of the Mail and Guardian's thought leaders, she has written reviews and commentary on issues ranging from World Cup rugby, the public gaze on the athlete Caster Semenya, homophobia, xenophobia, and animal rights. Dr. Sanger, over to you, and then immediately to Professor Yeboah afterwards. We are looking forward to your conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to me talk today, for taking the time out. And again, thank you, Dr. Olofsen and the rest of the Stellenbosch Ubuntu Dialogues team, as well as MSU, for hosting these conversations, which offer a space for us to engage. And thanks too to Dr. Amy for being willing to talk about these intellectual and by extension political concerns that are on my mind. I am excited about the possibilities that these exchanges have for our thinking and living in the world. I want to start with a positioning, but not in the way that we have grown used to within the debates around intersectionality in the last couple of years. I want to do something different and place my thinking alongside James Baldwin's, because it is here where I feel I can locate most closely what I will talk about today. In a conversation in August 1970 between Margaret Mead and James Baldwin focused on forgiveness and the difference between guilt and responsibility, Baldwin says, and I need to read this because it's quite important for how I plan to move through the presentation. A great deal of what I say just leaves me open, I suppose, to a vast amount of misunderstanding. A great deal of what I say is based on an assumption which I hold and don't always state. You know, my fury about people is based precisely on the fact that I consider them to be responsible, moral creatures who so often do not act that way. But I am not surprised when they do. I am not that wretched a pessimist, and I wouldn't sound the way I sound if I did not expect what I expect from human beings, if I didn't have some ultimate faith and love, faith in them and love for them. You see, I am a human being too, and I have no right to stand in judgment of the world as though I am not a part of it. What I am demanding of other people is what I am demanding of myself. I concur with Baldwin, and I love this quote because it really situates how I think about myself in the world as a scholar, and I think of myself in the world in personal ways, how I interact with the social. When I talk about white individualism, male violence, and Ubuntu, I am making all sorts of judgments. I am not unbiased. I am not looking in from the outside because I am implicated. Some of my most significant relationships are with men and people raised as white, both born in South Africa and outside of these borders. So the things I think about and present here today are about people who matter greatly to me. And of course, I'm guilty too of the very things I wish to see change in the world. We are all implicated. I am as critical of the world as I am of myself, particularly myself inside of this world. My scholarship, I hope, is an honest one that is engaged with both the personal and the political. Being with others is central to human existence. Being with others has historically been and continues to be joyful and affirming, as well as torturous and painful. When Maria Lugoens asks, how do we learn about each other? How do we do it without harming each other, but with the courage to take up a weaving of the everyday that may reveal deep betrayals? How do we cross without taking over? With whom do we do this work? The theoretical here is immediately practical. How do we practice with each other, engaging in dialogue at the colonial difference? How do we know when we are doing it? She's asking us here to think deeply about how to be with others under conditions of depravity. These conditions are inequalities, violations, which render certain lives more grievable than others. This is what race, gender, class, and other such systems of oppression do. They exist as violations of human beings. Ubuntu thinking and practice becomes challenging through the existence of race, gender, and class inequalities. In countries with high levels of economic inequality, such as South Africa, and high levels of violence against women, practices of Ubuntu in the form of acts of humanity towards others and seeing oneself as part of a larger humanity are clearly compromised. I think about Ubuntu in Faino's Mangena's terms, where its philosophy recognizes the power intrinsic to the capacity for dialogue, and it places the community at the center of all moral deliberations, which are premised on the idea of communal or group rationality. I'm not going to read this entire quote. The important parts here is about the individual, the opinions of the individual, and how that individual sees herself within community. So essentially how I understand Ubuntu is how the effort it takes to do something meaningful. In model terms, it is collective morality that counts and not individual morality. Similarly, Dirk Lowe describes Ubuntu as a basic respect and compassion for others, which acts as both a factual description and a rule of conduct or social ethic. It not only describes human beings as being with others, but also prescribes how we should relate to others. That is what being with others should be all about. As the title of my paper reflects, I borrow and extend on Lowe's articulation of being with others as a primary foundation for thinking about constitutions of self in relation to others, of Ubuntu. There have been, of course, major critiques of Ubuntu, with some scholars arguing that it is weakened by autocratic and homophobic leadership in Africa, that Ubuntu might not be relevant as a social value for young South Africans at this moment in time, or that ideas of what it means to be African are homogenized and alternative interpretations are suppressed, with a massive disconnect between the ideals of Ubuntu and the lived reality of most South Africans. My use of Ubuntu as a concept in this paper lies in its possibilities for offering a philosophical and conceptual guide, a structure for race, class, and gender transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. This is a theoretical paper. Its practical counterpart is in a different paper I'm currently working on. So I concur with Illistam, who suggests that there are possibilities to creatively recover both the meaning and the force of Ubuntu, and to find significant ways to embody it in our society in the spirit of justice, equality, and healing. So my position then is that Ubuntu is a very useful framework and premise from which to work in an effort to minimize inequalities. Practices of Ubuntu, such as positioning ourselves as part of a community or the emotional support of one's community during crises, in other words, an injury to one is an injury to all discourse, are likely to exist to a greater extent within economically compromised communities of people of color, where people share both racial and class identities based on geography. However, in the classical Fanonian sense, and here I'm thinking of Frantz Fanon's work on violence in The Wretched of the Earth in 1963, the internalization of oppression and the frustration in the face of an inability to live a dignified life, to move away from a state of hopelessness and despair, often result in violations between people of color within these same communities. The high rates of violence in these communities attest to this. And here I'm thinking of Elaine Saylor's studies with Manenberg residents. Manenberg is a working class township in the Western Cape of South Africa, which basically served and continued to serve as a dumping ground for certain people of color in South Africa. Her book is titled Respectable Mothers, Tough Men and Good Daughters. Chris van Wyck's childhood memoir, Shirley Goodness and Mercy, and Jacob Klameni's Native Nostalgia are all examples of some narratives that reflect the complexity of human relations within compromised, marginalized communities during and after apartheid in South Africa. After that is a little bit of context in terms of thinking about the possibilities for both the practice of Ubuntu as well as the difficulty of practicing Ubuntu at the same time. I move on now to discuss white individualism and how this kind of orientation works against being with others in ways that are unproductive in minimizing inequalities. In an essay titled, Why Can't We All Just Be Individuals? And echoing Jane Flax's work in 1999, Robin DiAngelo describes white individualism as follows: a specific set of ideas, words, symbols, and metaphors, a storyline or narrative that creates, communicates, reproduces, and reinforces the concept that each of us are unique individuals and that our group membership, such as our race, class, etc., are not important or relevant to our opportunities. Largely enabled by economic and ruling class privilege, white individualism often works against the basic principles of self within community, central to Ubuntu philosophy, and pivotal to being with others. One needs to think about the notion of community here in a distinctly South African post or neo-colonial and post-apartheid sense. Our community is one saturated with various inequalities and as a consequence, severe violence. If one aspect of white individualism pivots around the belief that it is one's individual ability that results in success and not the structures of racial and class inequality that makes the success possible a lot more easily for white people, then there is an unwillingness or inability on the part of white people to see how they are privileged through white individualist discourse. DiAngelo further offers more succinct arguments around white individualism, noting that the discourse centers around the idea that there are no intrinsic barriers to individual success. Failure is not a consequence of systematic structure, but of individual character. It also conveys that success is independent of privilege, that one succeeds through individual effort, and that there are no favored starting positions that provide competitive advantage. The inability or unwillingness of many white people, particularly those not educated willingly and unwillingly in the language of inequality, to see themselves as race subjects consequently perpetuates existing race and class inequalities. As Ferber noted in White Man Falling in 1998, since race is believed to be something that shapes the lives of people of color, whites often fail to recognize the ways in which their own lives are shaped by race. White people often see themselves as separate from social groups, including other white people. And I have found, this is a very difficult thing to say, based on my own lived experience as a South African, that this sense of individualism appears to be existent to a much larger degree amongst English white South Africans who have settled over generations in South Africa. The last decade of fallist and Black Lives Matter movements have visibilized, marked, and named white privilege in important ways. White South Africans cannot logically deny at this historical moment that whiteness operates as a dominant norm, even if they are reluctant to understand the discourse of white individualism as an ideology of dominance that perpetuates racial and economic inequalities within post-apartheid South Africa. Colonialism and apartheid are two structures premised upon an anti-Ubuntu sense of being with others. They pivot around inhospitability towards the other with a capital O, a closedness towards this constructed racial and class otherness. I define hospitability as being unwelcoming and generous, as being welcoming, not unwelcoming, and generous towards others. Acts of inhospitability or hospitability are often performed by those who host and control a space. My work thus far has been particularly focused on white South Africans who reside in Cape Town, a space that has a very specific history of colonialism and slavery. I suggest in this work that white South Africans, specifically in the Cape, display behavior towards people of color, which mimics that of a host who acts inhospitably towards an unwelcome visitor. This is a very bizarre, although unfortunately normative way of relating contemporaneously when colonialist acts involve the theft of land and customs by the colonizing other. The colonizing other representing whiteness and therefore a self with a capital S and not an other constructs itself into a subject with the power to define the contours of the binaries of us and them. These binaries help sustain and perpetuate racial inequalities. In a different piece of writing I'm working on, as I said earlier, I use a phenomenological approach to offer examples how various forms of inhospitability, acts of othering in one's own space, one's home and one's country works to perpetuate and sustain racism and classism. Sarah Ahmed's essay, titled A Phenomenology of Whiteness, presents an exceptional examination of whiteness, and I often turn to her work in an effort to better comprehend the link between Ubuntu and white individualism. Ahmed's identification of the labor inherent in maintaining white privilege is significant. She notes that if the conditions in which we live are inherited from the past, they are passed down, not only in blood or in genes, but also through the work or labor of generations. This notion of labor is very important. This work that retains privilege, this labor that appears natural within the world, is sustained through white individualism. Whiteness may operate as mostly invisibly normative, but it takes labor over many generations on behalf of white people to maintain this norm. So it's work to maintain whiteness. Inhospitability and acts of inhospitability is essentially labor. It's work intensive. Ahmed's insight here into the links between labor and orientations is very useful. She speaks about the notion of whiteness as orientation. She speaks about the idea that we inherit reachability of some objects, that things and objects are within our reach. Opportunities are within our reach precisely because we inherit that orientation over generations. So race, she says, in this moment becomes that which is within reach, what is accessible to us. And that, of course, as I said earlier, is about opportunity. Of course, this would be applicable to all racial subject positions. It is why, for example, a lack of resources for poor and working class people of color plays a significant role in the kinds of skills they learn. As an inheritance, then, white individualism can be understood as an orientation, a way of relating to the world, of being with others, that, at least in the South African context, perpetuates existing inequalities through ideas and acts of separation and personal choice. It is not merely a matter of an individual who is responsible for her own actions and choices, but is about how the individual matters above the community, and above a community that is part of a country where high levels of inequality mean that violence becomes a normative reality. As I noted earlier, colonialism, apartheid, and capitalism are forms of structures and systems that are based on non-Ubuntu ways of being with others. In a country with chronically high inequalities, work that makes visible white individualist discourses, which essentially sustains these inequalities, is necessary. I'm going to stop there for a second because I move on now to gender and violence. My second focus in this presentation, in some ways, seems even harder for me to talk about. It pivots around the notion of being with others and gender violence, but not in the way that I think people would expect. I spend some time in context in this section because current discourses about men of color and violence require critical engagement. Primarily, boys and men of color are viewed through the prism of violence and as innately damage doing. This kind of discourse suggests that boys and men are incapable of being with others. We know that the levels of violence against women in South Africa are incredibly high, with nearly 3,000 women murdered between April 2018 and March 2019 alone. And our rape statistics are the highest in the world. However, less spoken about is the fact that South Africa's levels of violence between men are also high. Kopano Ratele notes, for instance, that in South African cities, Black males between the ages of 20 and 40 are roughly 9 times as likely to die from homicidal violence as Black females in the corresponding age group, 17 times as likely as white males in the same age group, and about 35 times as likely as Indian females. However, the absence of certain questions about men of color in most critical studies of men and masculinities, including feminist studies, reveals that we actually know very little about men of color as human beings. A critical, well-researched analysis of violence between men seldom makes for conversation in academic theory and public discourse. And asking questions about this violence might yield knowledge that will enable different approaches to gender-based violence. We do not have sufficient evidence-based data for why Black men violate women and one another. Feminist theory over the decades is a lot more developed in terms of its social constructionist understanding of male violence against women, even though this knowledge falls short if it is not accompanied by documented research that first attempts to comprehend men throughout their lifespans, and second, looks at men as critical of their own gendered positionings and gendered relations with others, as Gratelli has also argued. In other words, we need more evidence-based research that does not only locate men of color as perpetrators of violence. What we do know is that various expressions of violence in any one specific country is closely tied to high levels of poverty and inequality. We see this in post-colonized countries where high rates of violence, such as Venezuela, with high rates of violence, such as Venezuela, South Africa, and Brazil. In the United States, the harassment and murders of Black men read as working class when they are visible in public spaces. Well-known cases, examples are George Floyd in 2020, or more recently, the shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, reflect political brutality which echoes America's history of slavery and segregation. In South Africa, there are numerous cases of boys and young men of color involved or uninvolved in gang activity who are victims of murder, always by other men. This violence between men is concentrated within communities of color, sometimes moving outside of these community margins into the public sphere, clearly pointing again to the ways in which post or neo-colonial societies' levels of violence are tied to the socio-economic and histories of racialization, gender, and inequality. Reports of harmed men of color can be found mainly in South African community newspapers such as The Voice or Die Son, in English, The Sun, whose readership are people who live in working class and poor communities, but it seldom makes national news unless the male victim in question is white and wealthy. This absence tells us a lot about how men and boys of color are narrated in public discourse. This harm of boys and men, which can be understood in both psychological and physical terms, is not well understood. This takes us back to how boys and men are socialized within families and communities as incapable of being harmed, a dangerous and baseless construction. An important point, Gratelli, and you can see I lean on Gratelli's work quite a lot, is that critical research does not take seriously the differences between men of color, which include those of class, sexuality, and cultural traditions, but also education, men of color's values, their preferences, their personalities and desires. By treating boys and men of color, as we often do Black people, as a singular mass of people, a homogeneous mass of people, we disable our ability to see them outside of the prism of damage doing. The dominant narrative about men of color in particular is that they are inherently violent, as I said, and not full and potentially interesting human beings. If we are to understand male violence, then we have to pursue research that collects evidence about men at various points in their lives across their lifespans. The research must be geographically and contextually specific. Much of what we articulate about men is based on hearsay. In other words, popular discourses such as boys don't cry, boys like blue, or boys will be boys discourse are dangerous articulations that are commonly taken as truth in gender talk. It does not seem helpful to me to produce more knowledge about masculinity that locates Black boys and men primarily through this prism of violence and damage doing particularly. This kind of knowledge, despite its importance, has not lowered the levels of violence perpetrated by men of color against women and other men. Male violence continues to work against Ubuntu thinking and practice, fracturing and destroying Black working class and poor communities and nations. This violence perpetuates racial logic that Black communities are violent and destructive without locating this violence as excesses of South Africa's history. This tradition of male violation of women continues to find a home in various communities of color, with these communities as physical and psychical spaces being a direct consequence of apartheid intelligibility. If we return to the non-seminal text, Wretched of the Earth, we revolt, he says, simply because for many reasons we can no longer breathe. It is quite possible to think about men as gendered in ways that are suffocating. The inference of privilege based on societal constructions of white men as superior should be read alongside gendered constructions as suffocating and harmful to men of color. The argument of invisible and normative privilege being conferred to men of color by society does not work in the same way as it would for white men. It has long been established by Black feminists in various African contexts that a westernized version of feminism is inadequate in spaces where colonialism has taken place, that Black people, women and men, need to work together in the face of continuous racism. The work of Chikwenye Okonjo Ogunyemi in a 1985 article on womanism is a key text in this regard. However, male violence betrays such Ubuntu-oriented anti-racist community work. Instead, this violence is antagonistic to being with others through both a violation of women as well as men. Recently, in a Men Engage Ubuntu symposium run by Sonke Gender Justice, a panel was focused on men and caring. That is, men learning the value of caring for others and being cared for as central to a sense of masculinity and humanity. Being cared for requires allowing oneself to be vulnerable, a trait that boys and men in many societies across the world have been taught to avoid in the belief that it reveals male weakness. The expression of aggression and violence on the other is believed to be reflective of biological innate masculinity. It is a very dangerous myth. The notion of men caring for others, not doing harm to others, is obviously central to Ubuntu thinking and practice. Violation of others works against being with others. However, to reiterate, we hold decades of documented feminist research on the social construction of masculinities. We need to look at men in their specific context, personal, social, geographical, and across their lifespans, alongside remedies that engage men in seeing the significance of caring for others. I'm ending now. There are different forms of violation. When I discuss white individualism in the first half of this paper, what I wish to argue for is how these orientations, essentially towards the self, work against being with others. The ability to move towards and access objects placed within reach, made accessible to and by white South Africans through undeserved privilege, with the latter wrongfully being understood as individual merit, maintains racial and economic inequalities. In some ways, one might argue this individualism is a violation of the principles of Ubuntu, of seeing ourselves as a whole, making up a national community that is struggling to find dignity and peace. Men's violations of other men and women are clearly to identify as direct forms of non-Ubuntu practice, disallowing others the decision and agency to live or die, or how they use their bodies, is directly against being with others. Still, the popular discourse that men of color are primarily damage-doing and inherently violent suggests that they are incapable of being with others. And this, I think I'm arguing, is a problem. That if this is the way in which we think about being boys and men, and this is the kind of discourse that infiltrates our families and our communities, that we are contributing to this notion that boys and men are incapable of being with others in healthy ways in the first instance. I can offer examples of this that would take me back to when I had a child and the kind of comments I got from people because it was a boy child. And there's lots of examples that people have experienced, but we don't have time for that. So a more holistic and useful approach to male violence is to attempt to understand boys and men in their various spaces that they inhabit and across the individual differences. I do not have concluding thoughts for how to move forward. I don't have answers. I think I'm thinking through these things. It's a work in progress, as all scholarship is. But I do ask myself what kind of responsibility I can take in shifting things, because essentially for me, it often comes back, this whole notion of Ubuntu, notion of being with others always comes back to me. It comes back to the economy. For me, it's very much tied to what people do not have, what they need in order to live a dignified life. How can my relations with others lean towards a socially and emotionally intelligent engagement that moves us away from violation? And I think I'll just stop with that question. I look forward to hearing what people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Professor Yeboah, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sanger, for a great paper. I think your thoughts in the paper and theory were very powerful and very thought-provoking. Just in thinking about the context of whiteness, violence. Can you hear me well?
Okay.
Yes, okay. Whiteness, violence, understanding how we can definitely be with each other as a goal is a very powerful, powerful command and powerful moment for us to think as we are going through this Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a dialogue today, so I will kind of have a conversation as we talk. I encourage everyone to kind of put their questions in the Q&A section for the Q&A portion. But in thinking about your paper, the first thing that came to mind to me from the US context, you know, coming from across the water, thinking about Du Bois, early scholar, another scholar, recent scholar, Daniel Black, he writes a book about looking at colonialism and enslavement and the content. He talks about we can spend time thinking about what happened to Black bodies physically through slavery, but how much time do we spend about thinking about what's happening also to white bodies, right? What's happening and dealing with white men who are taking from the continent their wives and sons who are benefiting from this capture. How much work do you think we need to somewhat continue to invest in looking at whiteness? That's my first question.
It's important that, and I think I have two responses to that question. On the one hand, I've asked myself why I keep going back to the study of whiteness. So I keep going back there. I will do other kinds of work around race, and then I keep going back to the study of whiteness in some way. And for me, if I think about race as a system, a structure, there's different kinds of work that we do in order to engage with racism, etc. And often a lot of that work needs to be located amongst people of color. I'm using the term, they don't mean the same things. And I didn't offer, in the paper, I offer a description of why I use people of color sometimes. And then on the other hand, I feel that if whiteness operates as a norm in society, even though it's no longer as invisible as it used to be, because Black Lives Matter and other such movements have shown how whiteness continues to operate in societies across the globe, then I don't see how we can talk about race if we are not engaging the centrality of white dominance. So I do think it's important, but I also think it's important to be doing work around race that sometimes has nothing to do with whiteness. But then I wonder, is it ever possible to do that either? You know, how do we do that? I keep going back there.
Yeah, and even you brought up the question of when we talk about leading the work, should people of color be leading the work? When we look at, not to jump back and forth, but when we talk about issues around violence, right? Many times we see women leading the work, right, in many cases, but do we think about where men fall in doing that work as well, right? So in thinking about the work that has to be done for us to be together, how much focus do we have to kind of think about where does whiteness stand and how much work whiteness has to put into us kind of bringing ourselves together? So I think it's a great question. Do you believe that, at one point talk about the benefits, right? Who benefits from the system still existing? Is it worth trying to dismantle whiteness in a sense as a theoretical system? Or should the work be in just thinking about building towards a better future? Or can we not do one without the other?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think we need to be doing both, maybe. I don't think we can leave whiteness unattended. I don't think we can leave it alone. I think it works to the benefit of white individualism to leave it alone. I think if we don't highlight how white individualism and the choices that many white people make, how that does not help us move towards a society that brings us together. But also for me, it's important. Being together is important. Being together in a healthy way, for human beings to be together in societies in healthy ways. Our society is deeply unhealthy. And the reason we know that is because the rates of violence so exceptionally. high. It's become unexceptional to even talk about it anymore because the violence is so normative. But that's obviously a sign of a deeply fractured, ill society. And so we can't not look at colonialism and its effects and how it continues to have effects today, and apartheid and its effects and how it continues to have effects today, if we want to move towards a society that is less unhealthy.
It's in the American context, at times when, let's say, Barack Obama became president, the question was, you know what, we are beyond race, right? Because we have a Black president right now. We don't see color anymore, right? The slate has been cleaned because the leadership has changed color, right? And I think what you're saying is, even in those moments where there is a shift in what we may see, there still has to be a intentional sense of undoing what we've been inherently learned and what we are inherently continuing to build on. Because if the foundation isn't set correctly, right, everything we do, and we saw that with the election of Barack Obama, we also saw the rise of, more hate crime, right? The South Carolina church massacre, right? So without dealing with what's at the core, we aren't able to kind of be well together, or be together, because we will continue to get up and come back down. Another question I think you brought up, which was very interesting, seeing each other's humanity. I think that's a lot of what Ubuntu is. Being together means we see each other, right? And a lot of what we know in whiteness studies is that whiteness doesn't just exist in white bodies, right? It's a philosophy, it's a mindset, right? It exists in many bodies that we feel that we are either less than or better than because of how light or dark our skin may be, right? And part of that conversation we talked about was the things we learn. And one of the key elements is the language of violence, right? When we think about America and Columbus coming and discovering America, right? It's part of that discovery is violence, right? And we're recycling violence. And I commend you for kind of wanting to focus in on violence as one of the key things we need to think about in really creating a safe space, right? Whether it's emotional violence, whether it's physical violence. How do you, I know you say you don't have the answers, but what do you think are some of the steps we can take to really deal with violence and creating a space emotionally at one level all the way to physically, for women particularly, but for everyone else?
I think that small scale work, I think that it's just not working anymore. I think that we need to be looking at people's frustrations in terms of not having what they need to live. Because as I said in the paper, violence, there's so much research that proves the connection between violence and inequalities. We need to work on the inequalities, serious work around inequalities. If that doesn't change, and I'm particularly talking about economic inequalities, if that doesn't shift, then I think that violence will continue to be one way in which people engage their frustration or articulate their frustration. Human beings are capable of great violence. We know that historically. And for certain human beings, violence becomes an almost sensical way of engaging a sense of self in community, a larger national community that has been completely erased, that has been where people are just not living dignified lives. So I'm talking about people of color as a group, and then in terms of women as a group, I think how there's so much work going on with boys and men at the moment. I mean, there's projects. But there almost seems to be a very fixed idea in different societies, some societies less than others. I mean, in some parts of the world where for example, men are given more paternity leave. That Sweden, in countries where gender is not thought of in the ways that we think about it in less equal societies. We need to think about what makes that possible. I mean, there's clear answers. People feel happier because they can do the work that they want to do. All human beings deserve that, to be able to choose that which gives you pleasure, which makes you feel productive, that this life is a productive one. All human beings need that. And when people who are disenfranchised and marginalized and have been violated because of race or gender, it makes it harder for them to live a dignified life. And so for me, do I have any, I mean, I support NGOs and all the work that has gone and continues to go into working with providing safe spaces for women against violence. And then also working with boys and men so that, but I'm so critical of that work too. But so I support all of that, but I really do believe that, I'm beginning to believe that if we do not shift things at the fundamental level of giving people what they need, so less government corruption would help, but giving people what they need in order to live, then I think that we are going to continue to have high levels of violence against different people, women, men against each other, and so on.
I agree. If you think about the historical legacy of what brings about, let's say, whiteness and oppression, it was based on economics, right? So we're enslaving people to be able to get money. So you're saying to reverse it, we can deal with the same economic system that was built to dismantle it. There has to be some sense of paying the debt to rebuild a better system, like breaking something down. And interestingly, you brought up NGOs. I was taught that some of the best NGOs are ones that are working to put themselves out of business, right? If your goal is to really to deal with, let's say, poverty, right, then your goal should be to do it so well that you in 10, 15, like you no longer need it, right? That's how radical you are to be able to answer the questions or deal with the problems that are in place. And sometimes we have systems that are there and they're working for the good, but their existence also perpetuates a need that still exists. Right? So people are still hungry, so you're trying to feed them. But if we're radical enough to be able to say we want to eradicate them, we have to work as hard or put so much in it that in some time frame we no longer exist because that need has been addressed. But there are so many needs that some of us are working at it, but they're still existing. Right? Mass incarceration in America is still an issue. Even though many people are thinking and writing and working on it, mass incarceration is still an issue. So if we think about that, how much work are we really dealing with dismantling it if people are still there, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we have a couple more minutes before we go to the general discussions. It's interesting that in the context of whiteness, there's a sense of not seeing whiteness, right? But then we look at violence, when it comes, let's say, to women of color, violence against women of color also become invisible. So there's this ways in which people are visible, uninvisible, are seen, not seen. Black men in their violence are seen more, but when they're violated, they're not seen, right? And there are ways in which, it's very hard to understand, what am I seeing, right? But at the center of Ubuntu is the sense of we are trying to be together, but we see each other's humanity. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, can we see people's humanity as the primary thing we're seeing versus the other categories that overlap, right, in this system? So that's one thing. Again, I encourage your paper forces us, whether I'm a woman, a man, even children, violence against children, some of that is seen and unseen based on gender and class is another issue as well. So I think you bring some very, very strong questions that can relate to us in the US, again, looking at policing, right? Who do we protect, right? That's based on who you see, right? If you don't see the person next to you as your neighbor, right, you may not want to protect that person. Then that person becomes a criminal, and that person who's going into their own home now becomes a person the police officers arresting, right? Because you didn't see their humanity, right? So at this moment, I think I want to turn it over to the Q&A to have some richer dialogue and discussion.
Thank you very much to both. My colleague, Dr. Geraldine Frieslar, is going to help moderate the Q&A session. And while she looks at the questions, I'm going to abuse the chairperson position and just, I don't know if you attended the last webinar where our fellow Dr. Motsamai Molefe spoke to Professor Moyo. And in terms of what you were talking about the conditions that create violence and anger and inequality. So he had an interesting, at least for me, position, Nadia, that was in a way, his emphasis was, he was saying that Ubuntu consists of three components. So I'm a person through another person to be part of a whole healthy community. That's what makes a community. And if I understood him correctly, his argument was for that first person to become the person that I can be a person through. I'm making a very convoluted argument now, but I'm a person through I become a person through another person. And he actually emphasized that there's also a legal and an institutional infrastructure that respects and acknowledges the human dignity of that first person for Ubuntu to materialize. So, you know, so he put it that at the heart of the problem, that unless those conditions are not there, that is more an institutional state responsibility.
And especially when you talk about immigration and citizenship, you know, I can see myself as a fully human being, but if I'm not supported legally in citizenship, right, my sense of humanity is somewhat conflicted. And in the American context, if historically the only human being is a white male, as a Black woman, I am thinking about how I am, how do I define my humanity when in this space that has not been defined? So very interesting.
It is all about seeing. I think seeing really is important. What you were talking about earlier, Dr. A, around seeing not markedness, how our bodies get marked through race, thinking about race through class. I don't think we talk about class enough at all. It's immediately and intensely tied to the economy. So it's about how we see each other, and when we don't see, and what we see. That I think is really important in terms of how we can be with each other. But violence really is the factor, the act. Violence in all its forms makes being with others very difficult. And I'm saying that very broadly.
And I also want to add to that, I think that within the concept of Ubuntu is also an inherent question of, do you want to be with each other? Like, do you want to? I think it's assumed that, you know, we all want to be together, but that assumption cannot be assumed for everyone. And I think that question has to be asked first. Like, do you want to be together? Because in some ways, the ways in which people act sometimes, their actions show that they don't want to be. Right? But we think they want to be, but they don't. And that sometimes is a hard pill to take. And then what kind of society do we live in where some people don't want to be together and some of us do want to be together? But we're all working together because we have to, or we're all based on how the continent was sliced up, right? And, you know, we have to live in this space now called, let's say, Ghana, because that's how they divided up the continent. And we don't have a choice to be together. right? We just have to.
I'm going to ask Geraldine to read some of the questions to us. I just want to thank Andiswa, one of the people in the audience, pointed out that I become a person through another person. That's the, of course, I know that, but I was just a bit in trying to make my argument. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to add to that, the more I'm working on this project and the more I listen to the fellows who's doing really hard work and critical work around this, the more I realize this is, and you use the word work a lot, Nadia. And I become more and more convinced that it is much harder work than it sounds. Yes. It's a radical idea. Ubuntu is really a radical idea. A bit like democracy. We think it's this easy. It's a radical idea. And it's really challenging for me to think through that, what that implies then for the work that we do around this concept. Geraldine, sorry, I'm going to be quiet now.
Thanks, Mariki. There is 2 questions from Renette. The one is, how do you think the holistic identity of an individual fits into being with others? And then could it be then that when being a human, just as I am, is not honored by another, it promotes violence? And then I'll give you one more question from Lisa. I've never thought about the other side of the spectrum and how white people may feel. Do you know? Do they know or care about what people of color are feeling?
I think it's Renette's question. How do you think the holistic identity of an individual fits into being with others, of which whiteness is only one element? I see she's got 2 parts to that question. And I'm just trying to understand the context of the holistic identity of an individual fits into. So it's a very difficult question to answer. I think, Renette, if you wouldn't mind giving some more context to the question, and then we can try to engage it. Lisa, I've never thought about the other side of the spectrum and how white people may feel. Do they know or care about what people of color are feeling? My first response is some white people definitely do. But I think we need to, I don't think I can answer that because I'm not white. I think that's a personal question. Of course, we have relationships. Like when I started the paper, I spoke about my relationships with people. I have relationships, strong relationships with different kinds of people, intimate relationships with different kinds of people raised differently and from me. And I think that's important. I think it's very important. I personally feel that there is no other way that we can be together if we don't move across. How are we going to live if we live separately? That's what apartheid did. That's what colonization did. But now we really need to move across, and it makes it difficult when white individualism doesn't see, white individualism for me is more of it's a system. It's a way of thinking. And different white people have different kinds of ways in which they engage their own sense of individualism. But there's definitely something there's something that one can call individualism that is linked specifically to people who are in white bodies, whose skin is white. And I'm speaking specifically about that kind of thinking.
Angela suggests that it might be necessary.
Geraldine, sorry. Maybe Prof. Amy wanted to respond to some of those previous.
I want to agree with Dr. Sanger. I think myself, I also cannot speak upon what white people may know or feel. I think at this point in time, what I am or we are concerned about is one thing to say you know something. I think that what we're looking for is action, right? So you can see that whether it's in your workplace that based on salaries that, let's say, white people are making more than the Black people of color who are in the same position. The question is, after you see that and you know it, what are you going to do, right? So that if you're asking, you know, what are white people doing to be able to deal with or take down, that's a question that we're all thinking about. What are the actions or steps that people are taking, white, Black, Asian, to be able to deal with the system that's been created versus just knowing and seeing and just decide not to do anything. But yes, I cannot speak on white people, I agree.
Shall we go to the next set of questions then, Jim?
Sure. From Alison, D'Angelo suggests that it might be necessary for white people to have conversations about race among themselves before engaging with other races. What do you think about this? That might be for both of you. And then there is one from Claire. She has, I've been thinking a lot about gender relations and the larger cultural shift in the last few years that has offered a lot less empathy to men, especially in online spaces. I think it was in Bell Hooks, All About Love, that she speaks about how subjugation within the workspace results in the subjugation of the family unit. I'm wondering how smaller practices that we have in our communities can mitigate elements of economic oppression that we don't necessarily have the power to change.
Yes. Yes, Claire, I mean, I think you're raising so many important points there. You're absolutely right. There has been a lot less empathy. And that is why I feel strongly about the fact that when people, what I've done recently is when I'm in engagement with people that I do know or people I don't know, and they make comments about boys or men in very derogatory ways, I immediately ask them if it's based on any evidence. Where do they get this information from? Because I think that it's important to sometimes, I mean, I do believe that we are human beings, that we emotion is obviously a big aspect of being human, but at the same time, I also am someone who believes that we need to work with evidence that exists, and that it's useful to have research that looks at boys and men and collect information, like I say, across their lifespans in order to move away from discourses that are problematic. I think, yeah, she speaks about, Bell Hooks speaks about how subjugation within the workspace results in the subjugation of the family unit. Definitely. I mean, if you're going to experience things that are oppressive at work, that makes you, where people do not see you as a full human being within the context of the space in which you work, that will obviously have an impact on how you engage and are part of your family community. Smaller practices that we have in our communities can mitigate elements of the economic. I think we need to have both small and large scale change. That we don't necessarily have the power to change. That worries me, that we don't have the power to change it. But it feels overwhelming at the moment, the ways in which people are unable to live. To me, it feels overwhelming. I see it a lot. In other words, I can live in a bubble. I'm half in a bubble and half outside of a bubble, which a lot of middle-class people do in the South African context, at least. Well, everywhere in the world, I would think. People, if you can afford it, you're going to live in a space where you are away from the violence, where you don't have to see it. And then, and so I find that a lot of middle-class people I know make those kinds of choices, and I understand why. I'm in a bubble, but I'm very close to poorer areas around me, and I see the poverty a lot, and it's become worse in the last 15 years, 20 years. I see more young people standing at the traffic lights, boys of color, begging for money than I used to see 20 years ago. That's not normal life. So I want to know how does that not become a possibility anymore? I don't know if they're even going to school, you know. So I'm using them these boys as an example of how our society is not at all a healthy one, and I don't clearly have any positive responses. I think that we need to be working both at the micro and the macro levels, and we need the state to play a much larger role in terms of making sure that people have what they need, and that is possible with all the money that suddenly disappears and gets used for other things as personal reasons. So yeah, there are things that are fixable. Let me stop there.
So, okay, Alex's question, as far as should white people have conversations about race among themselves before engaging with other races? I would say no. I think first you should have an individual conversation with yourself first. But as far as you having collective with other, I think growing with listening from other races is the best way. Whether even if it's gender, right? Should men sit together and talk about how we can find better ways to help women? Women should be involved in that conversation. I don't think leaving other people out makes the conversation better.
So there's a comment from Renette. I don't know if you want to engage that, but I will read it anyway. Identity consists of so many elements: race, age, gender, sex, personality, background, etc. If the identity of an individual is secure, the person feels secure and safe and comfortable to engage with diverse others. And then there is one in the chat box from Andiswa, where it says white men are more likely to engage in violent extremism because of how both whiteness and masculinity are expressed. Now with Ubuntu, we are in our world to improve quality of life, human agency, sharing values and principles in families, which is very powerful to him or her. So those are more like comments, but don't know if you want to engage.
It is a comment, yes. And there's I think it's very important to look at, there's Pumla Kola's book, Rape, a South African Nightmare, which takes us back to how white men and rape, the rape of slaves, slave women. And so it makes, I think, a link between that history of white violence against women of color and white male violence against women of color and the ways in which violence is being perpetrated currently against women. All women, not only women of color, but as we know, again, based on economics and geography, violence, the rates of violence are definitely higher in certain communities. That's not something we can shy away from, I think. So yeah, definitely, Andiswa, I agree with you. I agree with you.
That comment brings, I agree as well. For me, what triggered me was, if we're thinking about breaking down or disrupting whiteness, right? At its radical sense, let's say we're trying to destroy whiteness because we're arguing that whiteness has contributed to the system we now see, which is oppressive, then the goal would be to kind of, destroy, dismantle whiteness. Then the question becomes, who are white people? Right? If we're saying we're going to get rid of whiteness because we know the goals in which whiteness was created, right? So before there was whiteness, there was Irish, they were Polish, people were from other countries, right? If we say we're going to get rid of whiteness, then who are white people, right? How do they see themselves? And I think that's the question that hasn't been answered. Like, if we take white away from white men, how do men who were known as white men, how do they see themselves? How do they understand growth? How do they articulate, what's the language they use for development, right? That doesn't attach to a historical legacy of whiteness. And I think that question has not been dealt with for us to be able to really think about pathways of moving away from what has been created from whiteness, right? And until that happens, people will continue to either struggle between I'm less white or more white, or I'm existing within this sense of whiteness. And also for white women as well, right? I think for white women, looking historically at legally, right, the fight in America with voting rights, right, and the tension around Black men getting the right to vote first with white women, those tensions that arise in feminist theory. Who are white women if they decide to kind of put down whiteness, right? How do they see themselves in relation to their white men, right? Just came to mind in that comment.
It's a good question.
Yeah. And with next comment, as far as the identity, if you are secure in your identity, I don't think personally in the Khan philosophy and some other African philosophies, individualism is at the bottom of your identity. Like, knowing, you can never know who you fully are, right? You're always growing because people are growing, and who you are is embedded in someone else. So the idea of me being secure or me knowing who I am, that space never exists, right? Because I'm always growing. I'm always trying to figure out, whether I am a woman, then I become a mother, and then my sense of gender shifts and ages shift because I'm growing, right? So I think where we find challenges where people who are so definite and secure in themselves that they fail to look at and understand other people. So when you say that I'm so secure, I stop listening because I know who I am, and everything else is kind of like outside of who. But when you do that, then you limit yourself in growing and not listening to other people. And even the sense of, Blackness not being homogenous, right? There are so many different languages and people across the world that for me to say I know who I am, that assumes that I know who everyone else in the world is, and that's not true. Like, we haven't scratched the depth of our humanity and our intelligence and our sense of what we can and can create at an individual level. I would say that.
I agree with you. I don't think there is. I think that identities are made. In some ways, we don't know who we really are. I don't know what that means, because I think that if identities are constructed as they are we then saying that there's an inherent identity to human beings that exists, that we know what that is as an individual human? I know who I am inside. I'm not sure what that means, because we are always seen by others, and then we are always seeing others. So there's always that, and that goes back to how we read bodies and skin color and gender and sex and ability, disability, accent. All those things are how humans engage each other. That's how we are being together at the moment. So how do we move beyond marking? And that has always been difficult to do. I think, how do we move beyond that? These identifications that damage the potential of having relationships with each other rather than allows for us to be together in healthy ways.
I think you brought up in your paper the sense of fear, right? Fear is what hinders us from being together, right? So the white fragility, fear of power, loss of control, like this fear of manipulation comes to it, moves in these different ways that hinders us and forces us to create barriers or police each other differently or abuse each other in many ways because we don't have, and we fear not having or not having enough, or, fear is definitely at the center.
Absolutely. Fear is a major factor. I mean, in South Africa, there's an Afrikaans term, which some of you might know in the South African context, called swart gevaar, and essentially means the fear of Black people. And that has not disappeared because it exists very much in terms of where people live, how people get policed and watched. If they live in white middle class areas, men in particular get watched in certain ways. Men of color are potentially always, there's papers written about this, that the fear of men of color, not maybe, they're probably just entering and moving through the community. They probably don't have a house there. That is the assumption that often gets made, and then other more dangerous assumptions around crime, of course, and violence. And it's so difficult talking about men and violence because you cannot ignore the statistics. It's a very, very difficult thing for me to engage. But then I'm trying to move beyond that because we are with men are part of our families. They are our children, boys or men. They are our partners if we choose for them to be our partners, if we regard ourselves as, in that moment, a heterosexual person, for example. I mean, there's all these qualifiers I need to make. So men are part of our communities and we engage them in different ways. And so, so I'm really trying to think about how it's possible to move through this current discourse of boys and men that's very dangerous and highly problematic, of color, boys and men of color, in order to come out on the other side where we can, or maybe not come out on the other side right now, but where we can begin to talk about things differently. And again, I don't have clear answers. It's just how do we think about these issues in a productive way?
I'm wondering if I see there is still 2 comments in the Q&A that looks to me like comments, but and I think you may have addressed those. But I just wanted to say something. This question about do white people know and do they care how Black people feel? Asking that question to you, and combining that with that thing that you said, Nadia, about small acts that you've lost. I don't know how you put it, but patience or faith or in small acts. But I'm actually wondering, as a white person, I'm not talking on behalf of white people, and I'm talking about myself, is that I think we do too little of asking that question to Black people, to say, not do they know, or do white people know, or do they care how Black people feel, but to ask Black people, does it feel to you as if white people care? And if to ask that question, and what is it if they say no, then what is it that I am doing that makes you feel as if I don't care? But to have that conversation in a sort of to reflect on ourselves and be honest about those questions when we when we are with Black people and you know, ask those hard questions that would reflect, you know, on our how do we relate to others, as you say, with a capital O, you know, to be more honest in that engagement, to find out what is it that we do that make Black people feel that we don't care. I mean, obviously things are obvious, but it's those small acts. Like I hear a lot of my friends sort of making light of microaggressions, you know, like, I mean, not, but, and, you know, it's so underestimated how hurtful those small things can be, you know, that the way you look, the way you treat, the way you address, the way you don't pay attention. And as I say, I'm talking about myself as well. We have about 5 minutes left. So Geraldine, I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to bring, or if you, Prof. Amy or Nadia, if you see something in the chat file or the Q&A that you wanted to respond to.
Thank you very much for these questions, and thank you for coming actually and listening to us engage around these issues. It's nice to see that, you know, people are wanting to talk about them. So no, I don't think so. Dr. A, I'm not sure if you...
No, again, thank you as well. And thank you for all the guests who are watching and will watch later as well.
Yes, and I also want to thank everybody who signed up and who was part of this webinar. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Professor Yeboah. I really appreciate the investment, the time that you invested in this, and that you are both helping us to think this through and taking on this challenge with us to reimagine, to rethink what it is that we are talking about when we talk about Ubuntu. Thank you also to the audience. We really appreciate the input and that you stayed with us. We have shared my email address and Dr. Upenyu Maji's email address in the chat file. If there's something that you wanted to share with us, anything that you've learned, how we can improve these events, please let us know. I also want to thank those indispensable individuals who are always behind the scene, helping to make this work. At Stellenbosch University, my colleague Geraldine Frieslar, thank you so much for your help with the Q&A session. Alvandre, our IT manager and co-host of the session. And I also want to thank our colleagues at Michigan State who are always ready to lend a hand. Beza Desta, Nicole Mackenzie, and of course, Upenyu Maji. I want to share the details. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time on the 28th of September, 3 p.m. South African time, 4 p.m. East African time, 9 a.m. in the US. The name of the webinar is Making the Invisible Visible. And that is about refugees and the way that art is used there. Art is a connecting force, and it is our exchange fellow Emmanuel Chima at MSU, who will be in conversation with Professor Paul Bukuluki of Makerere University and Professor Thaddeus Metz at the University of Pretoria. So please join us for that. And then our last webinar of the year, keep that in mind, is on the 9th of November, In the Spirit of Ubuntu, A New Vision of Society and the Self. And two of our exchange fellows, Dr. Sinetemba Makanya and Mix Ashwin Tyson, will be in conversation with Professor Pumla Gubodo Maragizela about their work. That will be at 4 o'clock South African time, 9 a.m. US time, and we really hope that you will be able to join us for those webinars. I want to ask the panelists to just stay behind for a few minutes. To the rest of the audience, thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you on the screen next time.